Well, for more on that, we are joined now by Omar Saif Ghobash, Assistant Minister for Culture and Public Diplomacy for the UAE. He joins us now from Abu Dhabi. Mr. Ghobash, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, now that the peace deal, and you were part of this process last week, is all official and the T's have been crossed and the I's have been dotted, how do you see it going forward? Where are the key areas of cooperation that will be developing now in the coming weeks, months, and years?
Well, firstly, let me say that there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm here in the Emirates for the peace deal. And, you know, a number of us were very surprised with the amount of goodwill that is sort of pouring out into the public media and into social media. We were in Israel a few days ago where we signed a number of agreements. One of them was on flights. I think we're going to have 28 flights between the UAE and Israel. Another one was on economic cooperation. And the third one was on visa exemption for both sides, for citizens of the Emirates to go to Israel and vice versa, Israeli citizens to come to the UAE. And we're moving very fast on that. There's going to be ratification of those agreements before anything else can happen. But as you can imagine, and as you probably know, there are already quite a number of Israelis here in town, in both in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And it's, you know, everybody's really keen to get moving. It seems like this maybe should have happened a long time ago.
And how warm do you think this peace will be? Because, you know, if you look at countries like Egypt and Jordan, we talk about a cold peace. There are security cooperation, we know that. There is some diplomatic cooperation. But certainly in an area like culture, for example, we really don't see that happening. Social activities. So what is the potential between Israel and the UAE there?
Yeah, a tremendous amount of potential. And I think, I mean, that's the first idea that popped into people's minds here, that it's going to be a warm peace. Not that we've, you know, spent a tremendous amount of time looking at the quality of peace treaties between Israel and other countries. But I think if you look at the way our demographics have developed and our, you know, sort of commercial history and the history of the Emirates as a whole, you'll see that we've always been, you know, sort of reaching out to other communities across the seas. So whether that's Pakistan, India, or you know, sort of the Horn of Africa, and this just comes in. It's part of our tradition that we reach out to those we don't know. We look for opportunity pretty much everywhere, and this is just another. It's obviously it's a little more significant than the normal run-of-the-mill relationships, but we are a different set of people from, say, the more traditional nationalist countries that you have dealt with in the past. We also would hope that, following on from our peace treaty with Israel, that other countries will be able to rethink their relationship with the Israeli state and as well with the Israeli people. Because I think, you know, we're all going to be discovering a lot about each other in the next few weeks and months.
Right. Now, shortly after the deal, the announcement of the original deal came through, we had a representative of the director of an Israeli organization that tracks the educational curriculum in different Arab societies, Palestinian, also Egypt, and looked at the UAE, and we saw a curriculum there introduced, teaching towards coexistence, towards peace, towards tolerance. How important a role is educating the next generation towards peace in maybe making sure that this will be a warm peace?
Well, firstly, I've got to say that actually that is the tradition of the Emirates. It is openness, it is tolerance, it is a willingness to, you know, accept people who are different from us. And, you know, because we look within our own society and we see differences between those who spent more time in the desert versus those who are seafarers. And there are, you know, there are all kinds of ethnic backgrounds that are molded into the Emirati today. And I think what we see happening is just another kind of extension of that. However, when you look at what's happening in the public sphere and in public media coming in from other countries, we need to actually fight back against bad ideas by reinforcing the values that were really transmitted to us from our forefathers going back to the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s here in the Emirates. And the men and women who really put together the country and held it together. These are, as I say, these are part of our traditions and our values, but they can be threatened by very, very concentrated and manipulative narratives coming from outside.
Right.
For that reason, we've taken very bold steps within our own educational system, within the system of mosques and sermons coming out of the mosques, and to make sure that we root out anything that is based on hate and anger and all of those negative emotions. So it's vital, and it's parents like me who are interested in what's happening to their children's personalities and education that take great pride in the way the Emirates is tackling these issues.
Right. In fact, I want to follow up on that, because in researching for this interview, Mr. Ghobash, I see you yourself are an author. You wrote a book called Letters to a Young Muslim, which I was able to read some sections that are online. And you call on the younger generation in the pages I read in the Middle East to reject violence and extremism. One thing struck me in particular, you wrote, quote, "We all need to evaluate what threatens us as Muslims and what threatens our faith. I will tell you that the threats that we are warned against come from the fever-ridden imaginations of people who have not left their neighborhood. These are imagined threats and challenges." Now, you wrote those years before this peace deal with Israel, but I wonder what connection you see in those words and the developments of the last couple of months.
Well, thank you for having sort of referenced my book. I would, of course, encourage you, like any author, to actually go and buy a copy.
I'm looking forward to being sold in Israel. I hope it's going to be sold here soon.
I hope so too. I think that there is, no greater way of breaking down sort of these lines of intolerance, these barriers of intolerance, by other than by actually meeting each other, eating with each other, mixing with each other. One of the wonderful things about actually flying into Tel Aviv was that it felt like planet Earth. It was fine. There was absolutely, we saw people walking around, people trying to get things done. There was security here. There were political figures there. And actually, it just kind of reinforced, to me personally, the fact that we're all just human beings, and that preventing each other from speaking to each other has proven to be a massive obstacle to progress. And if you look at the leadership of the Emirates today, they openly and publicly say that the policy of blocking and refusing to communicate has paid no dividends whatsoever. And so we are expecting tremendous dividends to come from actually communicating with those with whom we haven't communicated before. And again, you really have to see how many young Israelis are walking around town, mixing with young Emiratis, talking about all kinds of projects, and there's so much enthusiasm.
So what is your answer to those? Because there has been obviously some criticism in the Arab world, in the Middle East, even elements here in Israel against this move taken by the Emirates. What is your response to them?
Look, quite simply, the Emirates, we have an identity. We approach the world by evaluating reality and then using our values to guide us through that reality. And there are realities that we're not going to deny anymore. And we don't expect necessarily for everybody to agree with us, but that's not going to stop us from pursuing what we believe is both in our national interest and in our moral interest as well. So, people can come out and criticize. It would be good if they were actually consistent in the way they criticize. I mean, the Turks have been very critical, and yet they've got excellent relations with Israel. And, there are senior figures who have criticized us and yet seem to find that it's okay to use Israeli hospital facilities for their healthcare. So it seems that when critics' interest is at stake, they're quite willing to throw their principle out the window.
Right. Of course, following the decision by the UAE, we saw Bahrain. Now we've seen Sudan. I mean, how much influence do you think the developing relations between Israel and the UAE, and perhaps the benefits that will accrue to both, will impact on some of those critics now of this decision?
I think actually the relationship that we are establishing between the Emirates and Israel is actually going to be very important because, as you have said, it's the first agreement between an Arab country and Israel in 26 years. We certainly have the intention to put our own color into the relationship, and that relationship is going to be unapologetic. We are going to maximize our sort of contacts and our benefits from this, and we likewise expect that Israel will do the same. There's not going to be a tremendous amount to stop that happening. Now, there are other countries that have long-standing relationships with Israel who haven't taken advantage and may now begin to see that, times have changed, and actually there is much more to be gained by working with each other than by stonewalling and blocking.
Well, hopefully that will be the case, and I think we're already starting to see it, some of that. Omar Saif Ghobash, Assistant Minister for Culture and Public Diplomacy for the UAE, and author of Letters for a Young Muslim, and I pledge to you I will purchase your book online. And
I should send it to you.
And I'll try to see that more people in it. I think they're handed out to a few people also here in Israel as well. Should be more widely read. Thank you for joining us so much on I24 News.
Thank you very much for having me.